Dear brethren and friends, it is such a joy and a blessing to be with you online. I bring you the warm Christian love from all the Australian brethren. I thank the brethren in Croatia for their kind invitation to share some thoughts with you on the allocated subject of machinery, an important factor in the great preparing for the great fire. Brother Russell, in chapter 7 of volume 4, shows an excellent understanding of economics, the Industrial Revolution, international trade, free markets versus monopolies, and the law of supply and demand. Initially, the Industrial Revolution provided jobs for most, but selfish competition and the strain between workers and their bosses, capital and labour would, he predicted, result in fewer jobs at lower pay, leading to economic depression and discontent and riots. Citing the increase of women in the workforce, cheap overseas labour, and advances in technology as developments supporting his prediction. Even labour unions, only recently on the scene, were described as being of a small help to the workers, while providing large opportunities for the union leaders to wield power for their own selfish ends, only making a bad situation worse. On page 354, under national aggression related to industrial interests, and I quote, "Here we have the secret of British aggression and empire expansion. It is done as part of the war of trade, the industrial war. Nations are conquered not to pillage them as of old, but to serve them, to secure their trade. In this warfare, Great Britain has been most successful, and in consequence, her wealth is enormous." On page 312 of volume 4, he wrote, "The prosperity of the present century has been under divine supervision." And he cites Daniel 12 and 4, directly the result of the mental awakening of the world, printing, steam, electricity, and applied mechanics being the agencies. The awakening brought increased demands for necessities and the luxuries for increasing numbers. And Daniel chapter 12 describes our day, and just reading parts of verses 1, 4, and 10 for time. Verse 1, a partial quote, "And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time." In verse 4, "O Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." And then verse 10, "And none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand." In the 1916 foreword to volume 4, Brother Russell wrote, and I quote, "The increase of knowledge is responsible for the increase of discontent and fear, which bring Armageddon, or the day of vengeance of God upon the whole world." The conflict between capital and labour is along this line, and we are to expect that such things will go rapidly from bad to worse. The running to and fro and the increase of knowledge are describing the time of the end. And this scripture, I think, has a dual application to, firstly, the knowledge of inventions and the knowledge of God's plan that will be revealed. Knowledge, as has been cited in the convention earlier, has been increasing since 1799, and Bible societies began to flourish shortly thereafter. The light of the Bible affected the world, even having an effect on the unconsecrated. Looking back, if the increase of knowledge from the dawn of history to the 1800s is given a value of 1, then knowledge has doubled 16 times within the last 10 years. Over 100 years ago, 90% of the world's population could not read or write. Today, 80% of the world's population can. 90% of all scientists who have ever lived are alive today. 50% of the world's inventions have been created in about the last 40 years. The historian Barbara Tuchman observed, quote, "Man entered the 19th century using only his own animal power, supplemented by that of wind and water, much as he has entered the 13th, or for that matter, the 1st. He entered the 20th with his capacities in transportation, communication, production, manufacture, and weaponry multiplied 1,000-fold by the energies of machines." That's from the Proud Tower forward. Thank you. In Brother Russell's time, it was steam and electric power in its infancy. Today, it's nuclear, hydro, wind, solar generating our electric power. We have the internet, robotics throughout industry, self-driven electric cars, even robots on Mars. Now artificial intelligence, the ability of a digital computer or computer-controlled robot to perform tasks commonly associated with intelligent beings. New problems will emerge when microchips are implanted in human brains. The unprecedented travel and the increase of knowledge clearly marks the presence of Christ. The Industrial Revolution began in the United Kingdom in the 18th century, later spreading throughout the world. And this economic transformation changed not only how work was done and goods produced, it altered how people related one to another and to the planet at large. It produced several effects that have rippled throughout the Earth's political, ecological, and cultural spheres. And this progress, although it gave great benefits, as well as some very significant shortcomings. The growth of road and rail transportation, the invention of the telegraph, later telephone, fibre optic lines meant that the world of advances in manufacturing, agricultural harvesting, energy production, and medical techniques could be communicated between interested parties quickly. Labour-saving machines driven by electricity and fossil fuels for fuel-powered vehicles followed. Mass production lowered costs of the much-needed tools, the clothes and other household items, allowing people to save money and build up their personal wealth. Rising demand for manufactured goods meant the average person could make their fortunes in cities. People flocked into the cities in search of better pay in the factories. But the cities and industrial towns were all ill-prepared to handle them. Local sewage and sanitation systems were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of people, and drinking water was contaminated. Outbreaks of typhus, cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases followed. The need to treat these and other diseases in urban areas spurred medical advances and the development of modern building codes, health laws, urban planning, and in many industrialised cities. The rise of labour unions began as a reaction to child labour, making factory work less grueling and dangerous. During the first half of the 20th century, child labour was sharply curtailed. The workday was reduced substantially, and government safety standards set to protect the workers' health and well-being. Machines made cheap labour-saving devices available. People performed less strenuous activity. Farm-related labour became far easier and safer, replacing animal power and human power with tractors and other specialised vehicles to till the soil, plant and harvest their crops. Other vehicles, trains, automobiles effectively reduced the amount of healthy exercise people had each day. Outdoor physical exertion was replaced by indoor office work. Television and other forms of entertainment dominated rising leisure time. Many people now eat food that has been processed with salt and sugar to help with its preservation, lowering cooking time and increasing sweetness. These lifestyle trends have led to increases in lifestyle-related diseases associated with obesity, such as heart disease, diabetes, and certain forms of cancer. In volume 4, page 271, we note Brother Russell focuses as selfishness as the driver. And I quote, "Truly the nations are assembled in a manner not expected, and then in common interest and activity, but alas, not in brotherly love, for selfishness marks every step of this progress." He cites, "Selfishness has gathered the nations and has been steadily preparing them for the predicted and now fast approaching retribution, anarchy, which is so graphically described as the fire of God's jealousy or anger, which is about to consume utterly the present social order, the world that now is," in 2 Peter 3:7. Our Lord asked in Luke chapter 18 and verse 8, "When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth?" Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy 4:3-4, and just paraphrasing the words a bit, "But the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires." And verse 4, "And will turn away the ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths." Our Lord Jesus foretold in Luke that in the time of the end, faith in the world would be at a low level. Infidelity is rampant from university to pulpit. In the Church of Christ, the Word of God is no longer the standard of faith, the guide of life. Human philosophies and theories are taking its place everywhere. Religion is no longer taught at schools here, and rulers of political systems have no use of God. So a survey taken from the delegates to the National Council of Churches some years ago revealed that over 1/3 could not state that they had a firm belief in God. 31% could not say there is life after death. 62% did not believe miracles happened as the Bible states. 77% did not believe the devil actually exists. And 87% rejected the concept of inherited sin. Our day, such a marked contrast to the past, that the church historians now speak of it as the post-Christian era. The moral fabric of society is at an all-time low. In volume 4, page 324, quote, "They have led men to trust in themselves and unions for counsel and relief instead of looking to God, and seeking to learn from his word, unbelief in God, unbelief in man, general discontent, restlessness, chafing, selfishness has been intensified." In 2 Timothy 3, 1-5, just some parts of the signs of the last days. Verse 1, "Realize that in the last days, difficult times will come." So verse 2, "For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money," that's affluence and materialism, "boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, in other words, drug addiction, senseless violence, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power." My dear brethren, do not the above verses just sound like our 20th century headlines? Some signs we now see Crime and violence continues to spiral. Automatic weapons are readily available to the young on the streets, for instance, in the US. About 100,000 guns are taken to American schools daily. In large cities, students are scanned for weapons upon entering school, and the halls are patrolled by armed police. Drugs are on the increase. And the drug war is being lost because the huge profits are just too corrupting. You see, by utilising modern equipment in 1989, the major US chemical companies sold only 98 million tonnes of chemicals to front companies in South America, who in turn sold these chemicals to drug cartels. 70% of New York City's drug users are wealthy. Over 1,000 drug-addicted babies are born every day. In the US, in 2022, it had 32 million drug users. Men will be lovers of pleasure rather than of God. You see, brethren, with increased wealth comes more free time because of machinery and prosperous ills. This has been remarkably fulfilled in a prevalent philosophy of today, that the object of life is pleasure. The conditions predicted in 2 Timothy 3:1-5 are further proofs that we are in the last days of this present evil world. In Ezekiel chapter 16 and verses 49-50, it was cited earlier, but it's worth reminding, behold, this was iniquity of thy sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy, and they were haughty, committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw good. So the iniquity of Sodom is listed in three main aspects: pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness, and the fourth one, neglecting the poor and needy. Especially, let's go to the first three though. Pride is the excess of temporal provisions, and leisure can be very dangerous conditions if not diligently fought against, and that's reprint 2306. An abundance of idleness is disastrous for mankind, making the downward course more rapid, and photodrama on 2435 pages gives you that. The neglecting of the poor and the needy in reprint 3948. And Brother Russell noted such displays of luxury and extravagance in his time will surely excite the envy and hatred of the poor against the wealthy. And you have that occurring in volume 3, page 294 and 295. Sodom is used as a symbol of wickedness, and verse 49 gives the condition in which the sin of homosexuality prospered, when there is pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness or leisure. James 5:1-4 reminds us of capital and labour strife. Come now, ye rich, weep and howl. Your riches have rotted, your garments have become moth-eaten, rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you. It is the last days that you have stored up your treasure. And verse 4, behold, the pay of the labourers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. We have strikes. We have walkouts today. And these are signs of the last days. The exorbitant profits of the industrialists and capitalists have heaped up until the last days, and the Lord of Sabaoth has heard the cries of the workers. Since the return of the Lord, much of the injustice against the working man has been corrected, but the protection of the rights of the working man is a phenomenon of our recent time. A few quick quotes from reprint 1676. But machinery, that juggernaut, which for good or for ill has crushed millions in its march of progress, has made men merely subordinates to it. Then too, money has been centralised and unheard of fortunes are in the hands of individuals. Brother Russell's time, there are 24 men in America today, he said, who possess more money than there was in the whole world when his country had the revolution which gave us name and flag. Today, the richest 1% grab nearly 2/3 of all new wealth worth $42 trillion created since 2020, almost twice as much money as the bottom 99% of the world's population. That's an Oxfam report on the 16th of January 23. During the past decade, the richest 1% had captured almost half of all new wealth. Continuing on page, reprint 1676, can we not also sympathise with the rich and those who employ labour? Surely this is their day of trouble in an especial degree, as said the prophet and the apostle in Zephaniah 1:14-18. But the end result of increased knowledge and with it increased ambition, as Daniel 12:4 gives. And he then cites the cases like that of an outgrown shoe. Once it was comfortable and it fitted in a desired shoe, but now it pinches. They have been stretched in all directions. They can never again prove easy. However, but will prove more and more distressing because the general increase of knowledge daily increases the desires and discontents of the masses. Later on in reprint 1765, it shows that the veneer of civilization is very thin and indicates to a slight extent what may be expected when the great trouble shall have increased the despair, the venom and frenzy. And then finally in reprint 2884, just a section, no wonder that a foreign writer, in reviewing the situation, gives his essay as headline as the industrial anarchy in the United States. The importance, the gravity, the passionateness, and the significance of some of the strikes have been very great. They have affected business, crippled many enterprises. They have caused bankruptcies. Never before in human history has the right of the worker to pressure management for higher wages and better working conditions been guaranteed by laws. Both capital and labour are tarred by the same sin of selfishness. Labour's demands will continue to increase for both just and fancied rights. Management will share just as much of its profits, and the death struggle will be upon us. And this equalising of the scales of justice between capital and labour markets, as in the last days of James 5:1-4. The verses in James also have an application to the public because of the mention of the poor whose wages are held back and the farmers who are not properly reimbursed. And throughout the Christian age, there have been two classes, the haves and the have-nots. But a large middle class is a peculiarity of our era and locates us very much in the day of the Lord. For centuries, the wealthy have been aligned with church and state in the exploitation of the masses. We are in the day of the Lord, spoken by Zephaniah in Zephaniah 1:7-9. It's a prophecy also to Israel and also symbolic of our time. To recompense the explorations of the past, the returned Lord has prepared a sacrifice from the greedy accumulation of the wealthy, and the guests, in other words, the masses, have been invited to a share. This economic levelling has resulted in the large middle class of our day. Also, today we have demonstrations and riots. The struggles between capital and labour, racial majorities and minorities will progressively get worse in the day of the Lord's presence until they end up in complete anarchy. Already, it is just below the surface. It's ready to burst forth at the slightest provocation. Just look at all the demonstrations in the countries around the world today. While the Lord is balancing the scales of justice for the past wrongs of the vested interested class, the exploited class by the unjustified demands and violence reveal that they have nothing better to offer, because their ideologies are honeycombed with selfishness and deprivation. They will accomplish but one thing: the destruction of our social order. The masses are invited to share the economic excess of the wealthy, and time is required to reveal the deceit and violence of the exploited as they rebel against the status quo. On reprint, in volume 4, page 294, an address before the World's Labour Congress said, "The industrial system rests upon the devil's iron rule of every man for himself." And then on page 307, "But the recent great increase in knowledge, instead of exalting knowledge, the seat of power, has enthroned selfishness." Pages 314 and 315, "General prosperity and higher wages, million of men in the prime of life, and by a destruction of goods and general interruption of labour." And for the past 25 years, Brother Russell said, the constant increase in standing armies are relieving Europe of other millions of men for the ranks, who otherwise would be competitors. Besides, consider the vast numbers employed in preparing military armaments, guns, warships, etc. In his 1916 foreword of Volume 4, Brother Russell acknowledged that events had gone longer and certain developments grown much larger than he thought possible when he first wrote the volume in 1897. But remember, my dear brethren, regardless of the timing, the outcome is well and truly sure. God's kingdom will be established. In Joel 3, 9 to 11, it mentions wars and war preparations. And we read in verse 9, "Prepare a war, rouse the mighty men, let all the soldiers draw near, let them come up." Verse 10, "Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am mighty man. Hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves there." In the beginning, Joel 3 and 1 identifies the events of this chapter as occurring during the regathering of Israel. You see, when Israel returns, the wars and intensified war preparations are further direct signs of Christ's second presence. The two world wars affected every corner of the globe. The sociologist Andreski, a noted expert on wars, writes, "Our own century in the USA has so far been much more warlike than its predecessors." In Time magazine on March the 9th, 1970, he observed that 187 million have died in wars since the beginning of the 20th century. As a contrast, only 3.9 million died in the 19th century. Verse 9, this is Joel's final vision, and the most glorious. The nations are gathered together, and it is to be for the very last time. "For the kingdoms of this world will have become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. For he shall reign forever and ever." And that's from Revelations 11:15. And verse 10 indicates that the money has been spent for military purposes, which should properly have been spent on what? On agricultural implements and developments. And that's reprint 3227. So in a way, preparing of munitions is being described here like technology, instruments, weapons, machinery that are so much required for today's warfare. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the relationships between the major world powers have deteriorated. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz declared the invasion as Zeitenwende, if I pronounce it, a turning point. Peace is secondary to power now. And both China and Russia are striving for relevance and appear to have a partnership. Japan is committed to rebuilding its pre-World War II capabilities in order to defend the Indo-Pacific region. India, the second largest country by population, has demanded a seat on the United Nations Security Council. In 2022, world military expenditures surpassed $2 trillion. No single power now dictates the current global order. With Ezekiel 38 pointing to an invasion out of the North Country in verse 16, Iran and its allies speak openly of weapons which will penetrate Israel's current defences. China just recently reported a 7.3% increase in its defence budget. North Korea brags of developing missiles that could reach anywhere in the world. In January 2022, there were over 17,700 nuclear warheads in the world. 90% of these belong to two countries, the USA and Russia. Israel has only an estimated 90 nuclear warheads, but possesses 980 kilograms of plutonium for a further 170 to nearly 300 nuclear weapons. Ezekiel 38 and 8 indicates a long process in the preparation and build up to the final battle of Armageddon. In other words, the attack on Israel. Rotterdam translate the verse, after many days thou shalt muster thy forces, while the Septuagint renders it, he shall be prepared after many days, and it shall come at the end of the years. Apostle Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5 and 3 writes, while they were saying peace and safety, then destruction will look upon them suddenly, like labour pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. The day of the Lord is marked by fearful nations crying for peace in conferences, but to no avail. The trouble comes upon them in spasms, as labour pains upon a woman with child, as 1 Thessalonians 5 and 3 brings out. In 1907, a world court was set up in The Hague in the Netherlands to arbitrate international disputes. War was outlawed. Peace and safety were assured. Then World War I shook the world with an impact unprecedented in history, as a whole world order began to crumble from 1914 to 18. The world has never been free from war in one place or another. In 1938, Neville Chamberlain appeased Hitler with part of Czechoslovakia and returned to England pronouncing peace in our times. Shortly after, the nations were embroiled in World War II. Since the end of World War II, no previous generation has witnessed such a frenzy of peace efforts, both on the United Nations level and nation-to-nation negotiations. Yet war and sudden destruction continue to erupt in Korea, Vietnam, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and so forth. The Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. No longer was there rivalry between the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It appeared the world would have peace. Then small world wars developed, like Desert Storm. The Yugoslavia ethnic wars broke out. In Volume 4, page 315, Brother Russell warned, the collapse will come with a rush. Our Lord's prophecy speaks of unprecedented tribulation in Matthew 24 and verses 21 and 22. For then will be a great tribulation, as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days have been cut short, no life would have been saved. Historians and scientists agree we are in such an era of unprecedented trouble. Historians and scientists state, looking back from the vantage point of the present, we see the outbreak of World War I ushered in the 20th century time of trouble from which our civilization by no means yet emerged. Directly or indirectly, All the convulsions of the last half century stem back to 1914 and Sarajevo, the two world wars, the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise and fall of Hitler, the continual turmoil in the Far and Near East, the power struggle between the communist world and our world, Edmund Taylor, The Fall of Dynasties in 1963, unquote. Tribulation as a result of Christ's presence has never been so widespread and intense, and some of the signs are population explosion. Before 1650, the population doubled every 1,000 years. It doubled in 1850, 200 years later. It doubled again in 1930, 80 years later. Doubled again in 1965, 35 years later. In 1990, the world population was 5.5 billion. In 2022, the world's population was 8 billion. Where will the future food come from, as there is not enough potential food growing land around? 15 million people die of starvation annually. There are 30 million refugees and 100 million homeless. Each day, 40,000 babies die of starvation in Third World War countries, while some countries spend over 900 million yearly feeding dogs and cats. Pollution. The US has 5% of the world's population, but annually disposes of 40% of the world's waste. That's 290 million tonnes of toxic waste. It uses 26% of the world's oil, releases 26% of the world's nitrous oxides and produces 22% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. Global atmospheric carbon dioxide, which is a primary driver of global warming, existed in concentrations of 275 to 290 parts per million by volume before 1750. It's increased to more than 400 by the year 2017. As the world's population increases, more people strive for the material benefits that were promised by the Industrial Revolution. So more of the Earth's resources are allocated for human and industrial use, leaving a dwindling stock for the plants and animals upon whose ecosystem services, clean air, clean water, etc., or the biosphere depends. Machines provide benefits, but do produce radioactive and other toxic chemical waste that contaminate our rivers, lakes, and oceans. Air pollutants from car exhaust and the world's production industry spawn disease. Deaths from respiratory disease doubles every 5 years. Skin cancer, caused by the depletion of the ozone layer, is rapidly increasing. Acid rain from machines is destroying our forests, which in turn produce global warming. This greenhouse effect could melt the polar ice caps, causing oceans to rise and wipe out hundreds of thousands of kilometres of densely populated coastlands, affecting about 2 billion. Dramatically increases temperature variations. And this would trigger life-threatening droughts and heat waves, turning breadbasket farmlands into barren desert. Severe food shortages would result. This is a quote, time is running out, according to Lester Brown, president of the highly respected World Watch Institute, to be faced with decisions that will determine whether the earth our children that inherit will be inhabitable. Scientists are now concerned that the population explosion could hasten and increase the effect of global warming. That's from the New York Times in 1990. Drastic climate changes result in economic disaster, and many nations could trigger wars for their very survival. 30 years later, the UN issues a final warning on climate change, citing a red alert. Humanity's on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. That was the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres in 21st of March this year, following his report of hundreds of scientists. And I quote, "Our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once. The climate time bomb is ticking, Guterres said, describing the IPCC report as a how-to guide to defuse it. The choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts for thousands of years, the report said, calling climate change a threat to human well-being and planetary health. It is up to each government to find the best solution, he said, adding that scientists hope these solutions will stabilise the globe's temperature around 1.5 degrees. It's already at 1.1 degree higher. For every degree rise means 1 billion people are displaced around the globe. Loss of soil. Here it's rather interesting. Brother Russell felt that the cultivation of the land element is the backbone of the nation, and once that is eroded, any kind of trouble can develop. The world has lost a third of its arable land due to erosion or pollution in the past 40 years as global demand for food soars, scientists have warned. The University of Sheffield's Gratham Centre for Sustainable Futures in 2015 published that over the past decade, the loss was catastrophic and a trend close to being irretrievable with major changes to agricultural practices. The continuing ploughing of fields with huge machines, with heavy use of fertilisers, has degraded soils across the world. Erosion is occurring up to 100 times greater than the rate of soil formation. It takes only about 500 years for 2.5 centimetres of topsoil to be created amid unimpeded ecological changes. We are increasing the rate of loss, reducing soils to the bare mineral components, he said. We are creating soils that aren't fit for anything except to hold up a pot plant. The soils are silting up river systems. If you look at the huge brown stain in the corner of the screen, it's the ocean where the Amazon deposits soil, and it's a satellite picture of it. You realise how we are accelerating that process. Soil erosion is mostly due to the loss of structure by continual disturbance for crop planting and harvesting with machines. And this repeated turning over and over machines exposes it to oxygen, and its carbon is released into the atmosphere, causing it to fail to bind as effectively. This loss of integrity impacts soil's ability to store water, which neutralises its role as a buffer to floods and fruitful base for plants. Degraded soils are vulnerable to being washed away by weather events fueled by global warming. Deforestation. Forestation removes trees that help knit the landscape together, is all detrimental to soil health. And this steep decline in soil has occurred at a time when the world's demand for food is rapidly increasing. The world will just need to grow 50% more food by 2050 to be able to feed an estimated population of 9 billion people. The economic chaos. The US entered the 1990s with a staggering debt of 3 trillion and a perilous foreign trade imbalance. The 90s witnessed the bankruptcy of many corporate giants. In 2022, the debt is only $31.2 trillion. So in 30 years, it's gone 10 times that of 1990. In 1987, on Black Monday, a 20% drop in global stock markets was a direct result of computer programs, machines, driving trading models around the world following a portfolio insurance strategy, all in tandem with investor panic. Just recently, 11th of March this year, in the USA, the Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. A few days later, on the 21st of March, the Swiss government brokered a deal to save one of its country's biggest banks. Indeed, our generation is experiencing a time of trouble as never was since there was a nation, as Daniel 12:1 says. Terrorism. In September 11, 2001, nearly 3,000 people lay dead or disappeared in the rubble of the Twin Towers on the Pentagon in Pennsylvania. You all saw it on the news. This was the direct result of abused aircraft, machines, by 19 misguided individuals only. Then the US was lured into the longest war in its history, costing nearly $8 trillion, needing more machines for war. Later, a gangster regime in Russia proclaimed minor parts of the neighbouring countries were a threat to its security and began a systemic invasion of Ukraine in 2014 with Crimea. On the 24th of February 2022, Russia expected a very short, relatively bloodless takeover of its European neighbour. 1 year later, the war continues, drawing in military equipment from where? The EU, USA and other countries, even Australia. The scripture also indicate that Russia will become again a power to reckon with. Recently, a UN representative announced more weapons were needed for Ukraine for peace, the very opposite policy of the UN original charter. Peace, not war. Sadly, Ukraine has ended up as a proving ground for international weapons from Russia, US and other countries, like drones and defence systems and tanks. You see, brethren, old weapons are much cheaper and safer to be used in a war than dismantling. For instance, in 2003 to 2011 and in the Iraq War, the US commissioned its World War II famous battleship Missouri to use up its stockpile of ammunition in the Iraq War. So its 16-inch guns launched 800-kilogram projectiles 24 miles away with the accuracy of a football field. A new world order then was on the horizon, but we're getting closer to that Battle of Armageddon. The New World Order envisioned that after 1991, the Russian perestroika or reconstruction now appears to be frozen in time by the continued deterioration of this order of things. And 1 Corinthians 7:31 says, for the fashion of this world passeth away. 32 years later, world leaders hope for inclusiveness of the New World Order. It's given way to a more chaotic world of disorder. Looking to Ezekiel's description of the countries that are meant to be gathered against Israel in this final climatic battle, we can see in today's disorder the progress towards this final battle when Jehovah shows himself to the world. Ezekiel mentions 2 precursors that are necessary. 1, Israel must be regathered from the nations to which they were scattered. And 2, those regathered must be dwelling securely. Israel's regathering and dwelling in unwalled villages. Ezekiel 37, 7-14 gives the prophecies of the rebirth of the nation of Israel and the regathering to its former estate. In verse 12, therefore prophesy and say unto them, thus saith the Lord Jehovah, behold, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves, O my people, and I'll bring you into the land of Israel. When the enemy host is fully prepared, the Jews will have been gathered out of diaspora and reassembled in their land, dwelling in relative peace, safety, and self-sufficiency. After 1,845 years of exile and being laid to waste, Israel has been in that state of regathering ever since 1878, with the national recognition, as we know, coming in 1948. By utilising machines and technology, Israel has greatly prospered. And a quote from volume 4, page 553. They, Israel, shall dwell safely, all of them. And in the final analysis, Israel will dwell safely. But Jacob's trouble precedes this permanent peace and security. After 70 years, a change in the Middle East. From the time Israel secured its independence, there are 2 simple truths regarding that nation's future. If the Arab nations laid down their weapons, there would be no more war in Israel. But if Israel laid down its weapons, there would be no more Israel. It's consistent with biblical Arab-Israeli conflict, and that was in the Wall Street Journal, October 19, 2022. Following the first accord of the Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, Oman and Jordan, all followed with peace, cooperative agreements of Israel. These accords reshaped the Middle East, bringing the world closer towards that indicated by Ezekiel 38. Today, Israel flies over Saudi Arabia. Sudan no longer hides armies for Iran. A new joint railway project promises to connect Israel to Saudi Arabia. Settlement of these hostilities suggests things are headed in the right direction of Ezekiel 38, 11 and 12. And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I'll go to them that are at rest, that dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor double gates, to take a spoil and to take the prey, to turn thy hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, against the people that are gathered out of the nations, that have gotten cattle and goods, that dwell in the middle of the earth. Israel is yet to live in unwalled villages. Remember that Israel has only 1/30 of the land of the area that was promised to Abraham originally. In Ezekiel 38, 12, 13, the unwalled villages means the militant powers of the day see that the land is completely defenseless, possibly peace accords. The Hebrew word cattle is not behemah, signifying domestic animals, but midnek, which means valuable property of any kind. The word goods is quinnan, referring to anything acquired or achieved, concrete or abstract, meaning achievements of trade or industry or conquest, treasures of knowledge, scientific research, or the know-how in our modern language, intellectual knowledge or property. The word spoil is tahal, meaning material plunder or loot. But the prey here is baz, which means living persons taken captive and is not applied to material goods. The intended idea appears to be that the seizure of possessions and the enslavement of people. This passage in Ezekiel provides two possible reasons for an assault in Israel. One is military, the second is commercial. But do not forget what happened in the Old Testament in the battles of Gideon, Jehoshaphat, and later the Assyrian invasion. Recent commercial developments in Israel. As we know, due to a gas leak, Russia halted the flow of natural gas through its Nord Stream pipelines to Europe. Plunging supplies caused soaring prices in Europe, where governments struggle to find alternative sources to heat homes and generate electricity. But in September 2022, after several months of secret talks, Egypt persuaded Israel to begin extracting natural gas off the coast of the Gaza Strip, which would quiet the contentions over that geography. In August 2022, Israel announced plans to export natural gas to Europe from two largest pipelines. Discovery of several large fields of natural gas was a quantum leap for Israel by industry analysis. The Israeli company Energean PLC holds right to one of the largest gas fields yet to be developed. The Hermes exploration well in Israel's military waters, it's this one in green, has yielded a new commercial gas of approximately 7 to 15 billion cubic meters. And that was in the 6th of October, 2022. Just how these new developments in the world's energy sources may further the biblical prophecy surrounding Israel in the last days is yet to be determined. Therefore, Israel now joins those Middle East energy giants jointly controlling the largest proven regions of natural gas reserves in the world. In conclusion, machines and technological advances have given mankind great benefits, like attending the Zoom overseas convention with all your dear brethren. but many machines do have significant shortcomings. The Industrial Revolution advances has given them momentum for the Great Fire. As selfishness is the basis and driver of the present social system, so love must be the basis of the new and better order. We have recently witnessed the failure of many global organisations such as the UN, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank and World Trade Organisations to address the world problems such as the growing debt crisis of less developed countries. Sadly, 53 of these countries are now at risk as global inflation wreaks havoc on sovereign balance sheets. International law is challenged. Nuclear proliferation creates the possibility of international anarchy in which there is no central organisation which can calm the conflicts. But brethren, watch and wait as Israel is the Heavenly Father's time clock. They now has vast gas reserves, which makes them very much a future economic target. As we see the unfolding events of our day, let us well remember and do keep comfort that Jehovah is directing all things. We cannot help but feel anxiety as we see these things I've just told and you see unfold in the media. Let us well remember in Deuteronomy 31:6 that God will never leave or forsake us. The scriptures assure us that the final collapse of the elements of Babylon will result in the great promises of a kingdom of peace without end. The Lord will allow mankind to demonstrate the futility of their schemes, as Haggai 2:7 says, and the desire of all nations shall come. In the last days, it shall come to pass that the mountain of the Lord, house of the Lord, shall be established on the top of the mountains in Micah 4:1 and 2. The current events will give way to a time when all families of the earth will be blessed and a permanent and far better new world order will be established forever. If the events of the future cast shadows before us, causing fear and trepidation, let us, my dear brethren, focus on the positives of the silver lining to those dark clouds of trouble we see around us. Luke 21:28. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up, lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. In reprint 1691, the scriptures indicate that anarchy will finally result and the relief will come only with the return of the King in power and great majesty. And so, my dear brethren, we rejoice that soon the whole world will see the glory of God and find relief for all human folk. We so eagerly pray, thy kingdom come. If anything has been said amiss, please forgive me.